Lowcock. I'm the independent chair of the inquiry into the Sheffield street tree dispute. Thanks for joining us again. Can you please tell us your name and your role?
Thank you. So I'm John Mothersole. I'm the former Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council. I stood down at the very end of 2019.
Thanks so much for coming. And a couple of process points I just explained to everybody who comes, so just let me run through those with you. This is being live streamed and will be recorded, and want to make sure you're happy with that and aware of that.
I am happy and aware of that, thank you.
Perfect. And as you know as well, we have to be careful in these proceedings that we don't accidentally say anything which is libelous or defamatory or brings into the public domain anybody's personal information which shouldn't be brought into the public domain. I'm not expecting to run into that, but if I get a bit worried about that, I will flag it to you, and in very extreme circumstances we may have to curtail the hearing. But as I say, I'm not expecting to be in that position.
Neither am I.
But you understand?
I do understand, yes.
Great. So we've got a list of topics which you've seen, which we'll work our way through, but just let me give you a chance in case there is anything you want to say by way of introduction to do that.
Thank you for the invitation, but no, I've got nothing by way of introduction. I think it's probably most helpful for me to respond to your questions and comments.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So, could you just remind everybody the roles you held in the council, basically from about 2005, and the responsibilities you had over the period for the development and operation of the Streetshead contract?
So, I was appointed in 1997, started in 1998 as Executive Director for Development, Environment and Leisure, so one of the Chief Executive's management team. The Chief Executive then at the time was then Bob Kerslake, now Lord Kerslake. And in 2008 I applied for and was appointed to be the Chief Executive of the Council upon the departure of Bob Kerslake. So as Executive Director, which was amongst others responsible for highways and environment, I with Bob was closely involved in bidding to government to be awarded the PFI credits for what became the Streets Ahead contract. And our success in that was announced in 2008. And then, obviously, as Chief Executive, I was the Chief Executive when the specification was formulated, the tendering was done, and the award of the contract to Amy was concluded. And then I was Chief Executive, obviously, right through until 2019. So I've been here in a senior role from the inception of this right through to when I stood down.
Brilliant, thank you. So you're in a good position actually to tell us a bit about the kind of context and the factors leading to the design of the Streets Ahead programme. In particular, I'd love it if you could tell us about what you remember about the state of the highways in the city at the beginning, but also any recollection you have about discussions on how to include consideration of street trees in the design of the programme as it developed.
Okay. So the state of Sheffield's highways in the 90s was a sort of note of record in a negative sense. They were in a very poor state. I don't know if we were officially titled Pothole City, but we managed to call ourselves Pothole City, and it was probably not far from the truth. And that was caused by a debt that the council had incurred through building major sporting facilities in the very beginning of the 90s. Which they had to service that debt for decades to come. The end is probably now in sight, but it felt like it was decades at the time, which meant there'd been a disinvestment in highways, and the council just really could not catch up with the backlog of maintenance. So at best it was standing still and probably getting worse. And approaches were made to the government at various times to see if there's any way of giving Sheffield some financial relief on this, and none was forthcoming, probably understandably. And then the PFI credit opportunity came along, a national competition, which was a bit of a get out of jail card, and PFI at the time was explained to us as the only show in town. I know people have views about PFIs, but it was this or nothing. So the council bid, and from recollection, 3 authorities across the whole country were successful, and Sheffield took the lion's share of the credits on offer. And we decided to put the street trees in because we wanted it to be a total highway experience of pavements, grass cutting, trees, litter collection, surface of the roads. We felt that too often all councils get sort of divided by the bureaucratic divisions within it. So the road might be smooth, but the litter might be everywhere, or the grass might be nicely clipped and the pavements might be bumpy. So we thought, actually, if you're going to walk down our pavements or drive down our highways, you want to have a total positive experience. And we put that in. And we also felt it would avoid demarcation disputes between a third-party contractor. And boundaries are always harder with third-party contractors than between council departments, so those boundaries can be quite hard as well. So there was early discussion about it, and it was a pretty easy conclusion to come to with ourselves and the politicians, to include the total street scene, I think was the phrase that was used at the time. And we put this to the Department for Transport, who were happy to see a contract let on that basis. Obviously the PFI credits didn't apply to all of that, and we already had credits in the bank for street lighting as well. So by that we were able to go forward and say, actually, the entire highways is going to be managed and maintained through a single arrangement with the council as client and a third party provider. Turned out to be Amy as the provider. So that was the logic, that was the basis upon which we went forward, and that was the basis upon which the credits were awarded in 2008. And that's what we took to market.
Great. So I wonder if you recall, during that sort of planning design phase, the prominence or lack of prominence or the nature of discussion around the street tree bit of the programme.
Well, it was deemed to be fundamentally a good thing. The council was aware that the street trees in Sheffield, which are a source of pride for the city and still are a source of pride for the city, were not universally in good shape. They hadn't been well maintained. When they had blown down or fallen down or been removed for safety, they had largely not been replaced. Many had been planted roughly in the same era. Some were forest species, not suited to a dense urban environment. And prior to the PFI coming along, we were faced with a situation of gentle but sort of, well, not even managed, unmanaged decline of the health and ultimately the quantity of the street trees in Sheffield. And we were aware of that. And it was a cause of some concern. It wasn't top of the list because we had, as a council, we've got many other things to be concerned about. And as it would have been a gentle decline, it would have been one of those imperceptible issues until suddenly you realise there are a lot fewer trees on the streets of Sheffield than might have been the case. So it was included with a positive intent. It was included as a solution to that I'll call it gentle problem. I don't mean that in a soft sense.
No, I understand your point.
More evolving rather than revolutionary type issue that was going to blow up. So that was a debate, and it was seen therefore as an entirely positive move, because despite the fact that frequently it was referred to as a tree felling programme, it was always a street tree replacement programme.
Yes.
And at the end of the PFI replacement programme, there would be more street trees in Sheffield than there were at the start of the programme, because we were replacing those that had been lost in the years preceding the contract. We did consider, as we put the contract together, areas of possible public disquiet as we went forward. This was there, but it wasn't flashing red. We considered other issues might have been congestion on the highway because we were doing a lot of road resurfacing. And actually, I think we probably felt that was the greatest risk of public disquiet, is angry, probably motorists, having to queue in the event, partly through, I think, good programme management by Amy, but partly due to patience of motorists. They realised what was going on, and we did a lot of signalling of what was coming. We never got that. Equally, and it's probably worth reflecting, one issue of disquiet we never foresaw, which did come up in a minority of cases, was in replacing the street lights. I did get some complaints from people suddenly saying that their garden and their front room was a bit too bright now.
Right.
Because they'd got rather used to either a broken street light or a rather dull street light. Now, we didn't foresee that. And 2020 hindsight is fantastic.
Of course.
So I wouldn't say that we were not cognizant of some concerns about trees, but we felt that the positive benefits of the programme, the recognition of the situation with the street trees in Sheffield and with communication as to what we were doing, that didn't flag as a sort of major flashpoint, and as we all know, for the early years of the contract, live on ground with street tree replacement taking place, there were virtually no issues whatsoever. So, as the contract progressed, we probably, I'm not saying we were on heightened alert right at the start, but we probably relaxed even more into the fact that this is a good programme and it's going well.
Yeah. Nevertheless, I think you would recognise that were everyone to be doing this again, there would have been a bit more attention to the risks around public reaction to what was planned over the time it was planned on street trees. And so one of the things, you can tell me I'm wrong about that, but everybody's told me that, yeah, of course. But anyway, let me ask my question and then you can dispute the premise if you want to. So one of the things I'm trying to ask people is, if everybody had known now what they had known then what we know now, what would the kinds of things that it might have been possible to do have been? So, would the risk assessment have been done differently to, for example, recognising that there may have been different perspectives in different parts of the city? Would the approach to consultation have been any different, or whether there might have been some accommodation or design feature which allowed a degree of variability in how things were dealt with in different parts of the city?
I think, this is with hindsight. So in anything you do, if you see the bits that don't go particularly well, you'd be foolish to say, knowing what I know now, would I do it differently if I were to do it again, rather than wind the clock back to 2008 or 2012 or any date in between. And as a generic point, I think there is an issue about probably spelling out more starkly for people what elements of this programme really means, so that tree replacement does mean that some trees in your road or street may get removed and replaced, and they'll be replaced by not a twig, a pretty large young tree, but nevertheless not the mature forest specimen that you've got at the moment. It would have been unwise at the start of the contract to go to any street and say, this is what's going to happen in your street, because we may not get there for 5 years. And when we get there in 5 years, things might be different. Storms may have caused damage, disease may have set in, trees grow, and trees that are doing minor damage in 2012 may be doing major damage in 2016 or 2017. So I sort of hesitate, because I think, going forward, yes, perhaps we would do that. I'd recommend someone to spell it out, but then there'll be something else in the contract that we haven't spelt out to the nth degree, and that becomes it's very hard, in my view. It's not that hard to identify areas where questions will be asked and good explanation will be needed, and let's explain early. It's hard to predict where flashpoints may occur and where hard lines might be drawn, which doesn't mean that one couldn't, going forward, pick some of the core components of a contract or specification and spell it out to the end, almost playing devil's advocate on behalf of the public to say, do you realise that it might mean this? And as I say, anticipatory, we did sort of spell it out a bit on congestion. And I remember on the day the contract went live, being on Radio Sheffield, being interviewed about it, and I think I forgot what the question was. It was along the lines of, have you got any message for the people of Sheffield? And my message was, please be patient. We all want these roads to be fixed, and we can't fix them all overnight. But please be patient. I didn't feel the need to be spelling out the street trees, because we and I think many people did, and probably still do, see it as a positive programme that was not going to be as disruptive as it proved to be in some parts of the city and with some sections of the population. I want to ask you about any observations you want to make about relations with Amy during the period of contract implementation. Well, I mean, I'm not saying this because it's the right answer in the proper sense, but genuine answer. The relationships with Amy were very proper. You know, this was a procurement process and a drawing up a specification process, and all councils, this council, are very good and proper about those relationships. So I say that not as a textbook answer, but actually the relationships were at all times cordial and constructive. Amy were very pleased to have been awarded this contract, it may well have been the biggest of its type in the country at the time. So everyone was very upbeat about it. But the relationship was very structured through working groups, etc. And my relationship with them was at a senior level where we would periodically meet, as one ought to, just to see if there's any, if we're satisfied with the progress our teams are making, and if any issues needed to be escalated upstairs. I can't from memory recall any escalation of issues, but I would meet periodically with either a senior director or the chief executive of Amy during that period.
And in particular, what do you recall of discussions you had or you were aware, say, the leader or Councillor Lodge was having with, for example, the then CEO of Amy, kind of at the peak periods of the dispute? Who was taking what kind of position is my...
Okay, so we were very clear and keen that during the period of the operation of the contract, including the years of dispute, that as far as possible the normal structures on the client and contractor side remained in place, because they were well established, they had their roles, and actually, a leader of a council or a chief executive of a council is unlikely to be an expert in either tree maintenance, road resurfacing. So there is a question of there's very little operational value. But it would be wrong of me to suggest that somehow or other everyone was left to it and we just sort of stood back. There was collective decision making in place throughout this on issues that needed either awareness being raised, because no one likes surprises, or actually sounding board. I've often, and people might smile at this because they might think this is writ large, but there is no monopoly on wisdom. And it's always worth sounding out loud, saying, this is what we're going to do. Any views? I'm not asking for your approval or whatever it might be, but do you have a view on this? Because maybe someone has a different perspective. And so during that period, the formality was as was. There was contact. I spoke to the Amy the then chief executive. It wasn't the chief executive when the contract was awarded. I think I'm right in recalling the council leader had contact, but it was very much along the lines of, is there anything more we could be doing here? Because neither the council nor Amy were comfortable in a sort of, we might have been comfortable in what we were trying to do, but we were not comfortable in the sort of goldfish bowl in which we found ourselves. So there was contact, but it was never contact to supplant the normal arrangements. So you would have seen, I'm sure, in the archive, emails between officers charged with overseeing the operations contract and myself and the leader of the council and Councillor Lodge, and that's a factor. And I'd be disappointed and surprised if I was looking at another authority and found that hadn't been happening.
Yeah. Do you have recollections of times when Amy came forward to the council, particularly from 2016 onwards, saying, look, we're concerned about this and here are some possible ways to solve the problem? Do you remember that happening?
You mean in engineering terms? Or
including in engineering terms, but in other ways as well.
I'm not aware of proposals from them, and it's 3 years since I left this council.
I know,
and I'm happy to be corrected if there are matters on record that says that was the case. I'm not trying to hide from this, but my genuine recollection is I do not recall Amy coming forward with non-engineering solutions about the way forward is. I mean, my recollection of conversation with the then chief exec was, we just let you know, John, we're here to carry on. We just want to make sure that that's where the council's at, and is there something that we're all missing here? So in some respects, it was more the opposite than, look, there's another way of getting around this, that, and the other. Engineering solutions. I mean, the council, at the point when the dispute was pretty hot, and lots of people, either, I don't know whether they're experts or armchair experts or whatever, we're suggesting ways that could be dealt with. We could deal with this largely through engineering solutions, and the council made it clear, and I have to say, reasonably so in my view, that they had increased their expenditure on highways on their side to fund the PFI and the trees, etc. And they were not prepared to see additional monies being spent on solutions that were outwith of the core contract, because any extra pound that went into that contract, and a lot of pounds were going into it, was a pound that came from somewhere else. And that's probably a point that people would generally make, but one has to remember, interesting saying this on the end of October when we were awaiting an autumn statement from the government, that we were in the heights or depth, depending on your view, of austerity. And we'd taken hundreds of millions of pounds of cost out of this council. And if you were say to me, and I can't speak for the council leader, but she would probably agree, what was my biggest worry in 2016? It was actually paying for social workers.
Yes. That
was my biggest worry.
Yes.
So, it was not unreasonable for the council to say, no more money. So if somebody comes along with a solution that says, actually, I think one was mocked up actually for a road in Crooks, where the trees were very invasive into the highway. Actually, you could build out the pavement substantially, create parking bays, less parking, and make it a one-way street. But you're talking of a minimum six-figure sum there. So, Amy could have come forward with solutions for all of that. They're a highway engineering company, and I'm sure they did. But within that remit that was set, and I use it as a remit rather than a constraint, because I don't think it was malignly put in place. They couldn't be implemented. They wouldn't be implemented. We were working within the confines of the contract.
Yeah. Okay. Just lastly on this point about dialogue between the council and do you have any recollection of the tone or nature of the messages being sent in meetings the political side, Councillor Lodge, Councillor Dorr had with Amy? Not necessarily you may have been in all of them, but anything that you heard about any of that?
Tone. Insofar as, and I'm aware of some of those, you only know what you know.
Of course, yeah.
I think my recollection is they were always, they were never angry, they were never desperate, they were never, what on earth is going on here type. They were always maybe inquisitive. Could we look at this, could we look at that? Or sort of lines of agreement that we will proceed, you can proceed, you will proceed, we know you will proceed on this basis. I'm not aware of anything in the tone that was confrontational, impatient, exasperated, sort of demanding.
Okay.
In that sense.
So, yeah. I'm going to come on to a bit more of a chronology now to get your sort of perspective on the way something's panned out. So when did it first become clear to you that there was a significant issue of opposition to what was going on?
Well, I mean, the most obvious point of clarity was, I'll call it Rustlings Road Mark 1, when the council initially got to Rustlings Road, because it was its turn.
This was in 2015.
2015, its turn in the programme. Sorry, I should have given the year 2015. And I think in the sort of short period prior to that, there were more concerns being expressed than had been previously the case as we moved into some parts of the city. But I'd ask you to consider that in the context that by that time we'd had 3 years of very successful implementation, neutrally and or gratefully received. So we were motoring, you know, this engine was purring in that sense. So it was unusual to start to get pushback, which probably made it a bit more obvious as well. And Rustlings Road was clearly going to be, you know, the pushback was clearer there, which is why in 2015 the council stepped back to see if there was a different way. Now, the interesting thing about Rustlings Road is that I won't put a number on it because I'll get it slightly wrong, but in the years before, several trees were lost in Rustlings Road.
Yeah, in storm damage.
And they were gone. And, you know, there were stumps where there used to be trees. So again, you know, our starting point was actually this is going to be great because actually we're going to deal with the damaging, disease, dangerous, etc. trees in Rustlings Road, replace those, and replace all the ones that are lost. So at the end of this, Rustlings Road will have more trees than before. But can I say, I do get that new trees aren't as big as old trees. But a line that I have genuinely articulated before is that this city has big trees today because somebody planted small trees yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe it's our turn to plant some of the small trees. But I do understand that if you've got a big tree outside your house and it's going to be replaced by a 4-metre specimen, it isn't going to be the same for some considerable time. Having said that, so you know that was our mindset. Our mindset wasn't gung ho. It was like, well, this is a good programme, and you know, with good explanation, it would be okay. And of course, it wasn't okay. So we pulled back from Rustlings Road because we genuinely didn't want the sort of confrontation that may well have happened at that point. And then spent some time looking at alternatives. The conclusion was that there aren't really any viable or affordable alternatives to this, and the decision was in 2016 to proceed. And that Rustlings Road became the pivot point.
So I'll come on to that in a minute.
Yeah, okay.
So in the wake, actually, or in the light of concerns that the council started to become more aware of in mid-2015, there was the Highway Trees Advisory Forum, which was set up, which I don't know if you would like to give us your kind of take, as it were, on you know, the message the council received from the way those discussions in the forum that Councillor Fox held took place, to the extent you were aware of it.
I wasn't massively aware of it, largely I think because you know, I mean, Councillor Fox in particular was well, all the councillors who've led on this have been amazingly diligent, and you know, that they would be in these meetings and absorb the messages and take it on to bring it back into the council. So you know, we had a lot of confidence in that process. I mean, the point behind the advisory forum and ultimately the tree panel, which I think you'll probably want to come to as well, and it goes back to my earlier point about no monopoly on wisdom. People have said to me, you know, not immediately prior to today, but you know, in subsequent 2016, what exactly did you think it would achieve? And the answer is, actually, we didn't know. Because if we knew what it would achieve, then we would have achieved it.
Yeah.
This was a genuine attempt to say, are we seeing this right?
Yes.
You know, have we actually? Are there some options we really haven't thought of that can be done here?
Yeah. So
let's open it up to a broader view of this, and also, you know, this might be a vehicle for us, in a cooler, calmer way, to explain our rationale, and particularly through the tree panel, to test the depth of opinion in individual roads and streets. So that was the thinking behind it. I mean.
Okay, and it was concluded that particular version of engaging wasn't working, essentially because there were a lot of quite cross people coming and feeling they weren't being listened to.
Yeah.
So what then emerged was the proposal for the independent tree panel. So I wonder if you could sort of tell us the origin of that and what the kind of purpose of it was, what you hoped it would achieve?
I think it was 3 or 4 issues. If I think I can use this phrase, but it was more to try and get George Orr, not war on this. It was more about, can we take a step back from toe to toe, metaphorically or literally on the street, to sitting down in a cool, calm way and talk. So it was a forum that by its very nature was hopefully intended to diffuse. Secondly, it goes back to my earlier point. It was to just pause and open up to different views. Is there something we've missed here? Are there viable different ways of doing this with people not immediately involved in this? And there were, we have to recognise there were a lot of accusations flying around at the time about too close to Amy too close to the council, and slightly more lurid accusations than that. So the tree panel of people who had no stake, if you like, so people couldn't throw those accusations at them. It was also an attempt to test the depth of opinion in individual streets, because I think everybody was aware that not everybody, there's no numbers on this because no one ever really knows, but many people felt that the tree replacement programme generically and in their street was a good thing. But not all people did. Yeah. And we didn't know what the views were in individual streets, and by and large my recollection is most roads and streets gave a very, very low response rate in absolute terms. But that if you put it to the vote, what comes back is what comes back, and you don't say, well, it's invalid. Well, in some parts of legislation you can now, but not this area. So it was designed to do that, and it was a pause, de-escalation, wider views. Let's see if there's something that we can adopt here that we haven't thought of, and let the panel challenge our thinking. Yeah. That was thinking, and that's what was attempted to be done.
Why do you think it proved not to be effective?
Because I think ultimately in general, the proposals that came back to retain trees were either not going to deal with the issue that replacement was designed to do, or often the recommendation was do further investigation, do root excavations, etc. There's one I recall where they did root excavate and found that the buttress route was significantly out in the highway. So a bit of root. I forgot what the phrase. It wasn't called root pruning, but there was a technique that was recommended to us, which I did actually find a little ironic, because when I came to Sheffield, it was in the height of cable being laid through cities, and there was a furore about Yorkshire Cable at the time, as they were damaging tree roots by excavating them and pruning them. So suddenly, there was a great movement to stop that happening, and now suddenly it was being recommended to us. But by and large, I think that most of those proposals were not adopted, because a view was taken actually that this tree may be causing minor damage at the moment, but it won't stop causing damage. It's a living thing. It's going to get bigger. Or through the excavation, the roots were not conveniently laid in a way that you wouldn't know from above ground. So it did cause more thought and more investigation and more assessment and more analysis, but without engineering solutions that were going to come at additional cost at the time, then most of those proposals could not, within the parameter set, be implemented. Okay. But they weren't just financial parameters. They were, actually we've looked at the routes, and it's way out there in the highway, and it's going to break through.
Are you aware that the chair of the panel feels that the panel was essentially misled on what could have been done under the contract, and that therefore what was reasonable for the panel to propose?
I'm not aware that obviously he has used the misled word, otherwise you wouldn't be put it to me. I'm not aware until now that he's used that word. I know, meeting with him in the course of the panel sitting, that he did feel that it wasn't as clear as he would have liked. He didn't say to me he'd felt misled, and at the time, if he'd said that, I would have a lot of respect for him. We chose him because he's a respected individual in the city, and I would have. I think.
Are you aware that there were lots of things described as engineering solutions, and the impression was conveyed that they could be done at no charge under the contract, right. But in fact that was not true. Yeah,
I'm aware of that, and I think what I would ask people, and that's regrettable, because it created that confusion, and there's nothing worse in these situations of, I will say unwittingly, raising expectations, right. And then having to not. And that was the sense in which the ITP were deliberately or not misled. The context I would ask people to consider is that this is. With the passage of time, these seem like pretty measured chunks of time, but this was pretty fast moving. Yes. And it was a dynamic situation out there, yes. And there was an attempt to bring together potential solutions. So things were done, or things were probably not as forensically prepared as you would want them to be, because we were trying to get things going. To get things moving. To what extent do you remember people weighing the likely impact on public confidence of setting up a panel and declining to accept a significant number of their important recommendations? I don't recall us weighing it up in that way. I recall more it was like, let's see what they come back with. I think genuinely we went into this with an open mind, and perhaps as a result of that, we didn't scenario plan. What will we do if X comes out of it or Y comes out of it? Can you see now that setting up an independent panel and then not accepting its recommendations in a significant number of cases might provoke a certain reaction? I can, but as a preemptive issue, that would have required us to foresee and therefore preempt their recommendations, and I think that would have had a counter view. Lots of things were said about us at the time, and one of the things that could have been said about us if we'd done that is this is a stitch-up. The council know what they're going to recommend, and they've already prepared the ground for it. This is just an empty vessel to give the council what it wants. So one of the reasons I asked that is because one of the other things that I think I heard from Mr. Bark was that, and I've heard from one or two other people, was that it's possible that had the recommendation of the panel been largely accepted, the dispute may not have escalated in the way that it did. Who knows? I mean, genuinely, who knows? I mean, yeah, fair enough. I'm sitting here thinking that there were some pretty hard lines in place from some quarters at that time, and it's supposition it would have been nice if that had come to pass. Yeah, hard lines potentially more. Yeah, I mean, to go back to your point, I mean, yeah. And I realise this is you want the inquiry to focus on moving forward and yes. Lessons learned specifically and generically on this one, and I think the point that is coming out of this is that finding a way of scenario testing what might come out of a process without giving the false impression that somehow what's going to come out of the process. Yeah. The sort of basic question is, before you start, so what are we going to do if they tell us something we don't like? Yeah. I mean, that's the basic question you're saying should be asked in future. That's the scenario. Yeah. I think I'd probably get a bit more specific than that. Because, right. Indeed. There's opinion-based stuff you don't like. Right. And there's pounds and pence stuff. Yeah. That you don't like. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for taking us through all that. That's really helpful. Now,
I want to come on to what happened in November 2016 on Russell's Road. I wonder, just with the benefit of hindsight, you would agree that what happened then was not an appropriate course of action, and if you have a view about the impact it had on the dispute as a whole.
Yeah, so I've perhaps taking it in reverse. I mean, I've said a few minutes ago that I thought Rustlings Road 2016 was a pivot point. It caused a sense of shock, and it certainly drew attention to the issue and led to people who were not closely involved in it and probably not directly affected by the programme to be drawn in and to form a view. And I think many of those views held, and I don't know how many people were, held these views, was not so much about why are you replacing the trees. It was a David and Goliath point, basically. The council has apologised, as you know, for what happened on Rustlings Road, and I think the what was inappropriate on Rustlings Road was the speed of and height of escalation. I still am of a view that what the council was trying to do on Rustlings Road was well intentioned and was part of a broadly well received programme, but it should never have escalated in such a rapid period of time to what it became, and that the council's apologised for that. It shouldn't have ended up like that, and it hardened attitudes, and it also brought a broader group of people in to the opinion about what was going on.
Right. After that, I wonder if you could tell us what factors, then influenced the council's approach to the dispute, and whether you now think that between, the second quarter of 2017 and the end of the first quarter in 2018, the council always got exactly the right approach to dealing with things.
Well, the council, I've said this a few times, but I'll repeat it for the sake of context. So there is a genuine belief. I mean, I think what separated us and the tree protesters was not the goal. I think we both wanted, they can speak for themselves, but I've said this again on public record. I think we both wanted the same thing.
Right.
The debate was about the means of getting there. So we were not divided by intent. Although things were said that, in my view, misrepresented our intent and was subsequently corrected. The council wanted to proceed with this programme because it felt it was a good programme, and we were still at that point, particularly in the white heat of PFI, and as I'm sure you know, PFI contracts are different. It's not just a contractor. There are four parties in the PFI contract, not two. There's the contractor, there's the client, there's the government, and there's the banks who are sitting behind the provider. Now, the banks and the government are somewhat removed from it, but they are there. So this was quite four-dimensional, and the risks of the PFI contract failing, stroke collapsing, were profound. They were operationally profound because Sheffield wouldn't get the highways it wants. There's a lot of money in play, and liability landing on one side or the other was going to be pretty horrendous. So people were saying, why couldn't you just sit down and pretend that this road wasn't getting damaged and stuff like that? Well, that's not the way it works. So the council sought to proceed as a highway authority to replace the trees, and it, as you know, the judicial review, which was taken out against us was very clear about the council's position. Now, the fact that you've got the right to do something doesn't always mean it's right to do it.
Right.
But we were aiming to proceed, and what was worrying us most as we proceeded was primarily safety, because tree surgery is dangerous. There are dangerous machines, and there are big lumps of wood falling down from up on high. So the tools that we started to deploy incrementally were fundamentally they were not to stop protest at all, but they were fundamentally to secure a safe working zone. Now, ultimately, the whole thing just ground to a halt.
Yeah.
And it was pretty obvious that this was going nowhere. And I maybe want to come to this.
Well, come on to that. Yeah. Okay. So I understand those were the things in your mind when you were thinking in early 2017. So how do we proceed? Basically, I understand that's very clear. So the council decided to basically try to use some legal measures from mid-2017 essentially to end the dispute. And I wonder if you could just take us through the process as far as you understand it on how the council chose the people against whom pre-action protocol injunction letters should be served and who should be named in the injunction as opposed to the kind of persons unknown category. Do you remember? I know you were in the detail of this, and I'm not expecting you to remember all of it, but
I was pretty close to it. Can I just pick you up on one thing you said there?
Yeah.
The council didn't seek to use legal means to end the dispute. We sought to use legal means to
deliver the programme. Fair enough. That's a fair enough distinction.
Yeah, yes. And I want to be very clear that we didn't use law to quell dispute or
yes, I understand. That's a good point.
So, having, and this is an AMI operational issue primarily, having sought to secure a safe site with barriers, which is a pretty normal thing to do, and then AMI employed security people to try and bolster those barriers, and that was failing. The council, as a highway authority and as a client, etc., was faced with the choice of do we just give up, or do we seek to take out an injunction to better secure the safety zones? And I mean, injunctions are not, and things like injunctions, like restraining orders, etc., are not unusual beasts for councils. I mean, they're not confetti and they're never taken out lightly. But it is a step that is available in the toolkit and is used, and it's used by other public agencies, as we see. So it seemed a logical and hopefully effective way of allowing protest to continue, but safe work to be carried out for the public and for the operatives. And that's the route that was chosen to be taken. I mean, we knew it was a step up, and we probably knew it was quite a big step given the visibility of everything that was happening. But we also felt that should we not do this just because lots of people are looking, or is this still the right thing to do? And I think my compass point, most people's compass point, is that in points of pressure like that, you revert to what's the right thing to do. Now, people will disagree it was the right thing to do, but that was the compass point. It's pretty well known that courts don't generally like persons unknown injunctions because they like them to be as specific as possible. We had a view about some individuals were probably, through their previous attendance and behaviour, more likely to seek to enter the zones, and we therefore named them because it seemed appropriate to do so, likely to be more effective in securing safe working. And the courts generally, as we know, generally don't like persons unknown, so we proceeded on that basis, which is entirely normal. It would have been abnormal to have done it otherwise.
Okay. Is it common for injunctions to be taken out against councillors?
Well, on the basis that Sheffield has 84 councillors, I think, in a city of nearly 600,000 people, just numerically it's going to be amazingly uncommon because they represent a tiny percentage of the population. So it's very uncommon for a councillor to be named in injunction, just as it would be uncommon for any small group of people in a big city to be named in an injunction. I'd be naive not to say that it was obvious that a councillor be named in an injunction was going to attract a lot of attention. But that would have been an entirely wrong reason. You know, councillors first and foremost are citizens of this city, just like me.
Right.
You know, then the law applies equitably across the piece. So we sought to put out of our mind the fact that one person was named as a councillor, because I actually think to have borne that in mind and for that to have affected our actions would have been the most wrong thing to do. Okay.
Can you tell us about your kind of discussions with the leader about that point? Because clearly, as you've alluded to, an unusual thing to happen.
Well, it is, and you know, politicians are pretty good about most things, but one of the things they hate is surprises. Yeah. They're actually quite good with bad news, but they hate surprises. I want to be clear that the decision to take legal action against anybody is always a decision of the paid executive of an authority, because you know, politics, no matter how honourable the politicians are, should never get involved in who gets injuncted or taken to court or prosecuted or whatever it might be. So the council leader was aware that we were planning to proceed with injunctions, and I would have been very late in the day, possibly, you know, contemporaneously. She was made aware of who was named, but you need to know this, because when you walk out of this room, somebody might put a microphone in your face and ask you a question about it, and you then want to know about it, so you might as well know about it before that rather than after that. It was you know, these things aren't secret, but it was information, not confirmation. Discussion.
I don't know if you heard what Lewis Dagnall told me about views of some people in the Labour group about that incident. Did you hear that or not?
I did see Lewis Dagnall's testimony or evidence. I can't recall what he said about that actually, so please remind me.
Well, essentially he said that had the Labour group known that something like that was going to happen, there may have been significant concerns about it.
Right, okay. And
I'm just asking if you have any kind of observation about that, really.
Well, but two things I'd say. I know, you know, Lewis is highly proper in the way he conducted himself. What happens in Labour group or Lib Dem group or whatever happens in those groups, and they will have. You know, I work on the principle that most political parties are in their own right coalitions.
Yes,
and
indeed.
they have disputes, they sort things out, and then their position emerges. So I wasn't aware of that. I can though surmise that everybody recognised the profile that this would create, and they were probably saying, really? Do we have to? Have you realised what will happen because of this? The answer to that would have been yes, yes and yes, and that's not a reason not to proceed.
Yes. So that brings me on to my next question, which is, I mean, you say there you think people would have asked, had you realised what would happen because of this? The question is, what discussion was there about whether taking out the injunction and then the committal proceedings would, in practice, have the effect of deterring the campaigners sufficiently to allow the programme to continue?
Well, the clear hope was that it would be sufficient for safe working to continue. I mean, I've got no doubt that the debates about the programme I mean, this was not about clearing the decks for the programme for the remaining 18 years or whatever there was at that particular point. It was about safe working on some specific sites. So it was never sort of, if we get this, then the programme can continue. And we at the time, throughout that time, we're always asking ourselves questions like, can we continue? What's the consequences of continuing? What's the consequences of stopping? So it wasn't like we carry on, heroically and stoically. There was always trying to find better ways of dealing with this and making progress. But it was recognised that it would be a high-profile moment. It was also recognised that at the time, it was felt to be the right thing to do, and the hope was that it would be effective, because all an injunction does is creates consequences for certain actions. Yeah. It doesn't mean those actions, in recent times, the public more generally nationally has become aware of the direct impact, the direct action impact, and as we all know, it divides opinion.
Yeah, indeed. So thank you very much. It's helpful to have gone through that set of questions. The next thing I wanted to ask you is a different topic. And that's, as you know, there's been widespread concerns expressed to me, and you must be aware that the Council's communications during the dispute lacked transparency and accuracy. So I wanted to ask you for your view on how effective the Council's communication was with the campaigners, with the wider city, with the media.
Yeah, I think look, let's deal with the thing we got wrong first, shall we? It was wrong, and it was a sort of operational decision that escaped intervention or scrutiny to publish results in the early hours of the morning and then arrive a few hours later, and that's been, now whether that's communication or not is a different matter. And I mean, I would like to assure you and those following these proceedings that there was no sort of nerve centre in the council that was trying to manage the dark arts of communication at all. Right. With genuinely communication, and the errors that were made were done in good faith. But they were done often by having to react at speed, with people who knew the contract intimately, incredibly busy and pressured and probably stressed during this process, being asked questions by a communications team who are expert at communications but are not expert at a contract, and sometimes getting a generic answer or a genuine error in what is said, and then running with that.
Yeah.
And and it's never a good day as a chief executive when someone comes in saying, "We've just said this, but it's not quite true."
Yeah, of course, I understand.
And you think, "Oh, really? Yeah. That's just set us back." But I think there is a big difference between genuinely saying something that you find out to not be true and being dishonest. And I would maintain that the council was never, dishonest in a way of construct or willfully. Communication was hard in this period because the tree protesters, however you wish to group them and call them, were very good at communication, and this was an event that gave a lot of imagery and was very newsworthy, and we often found ourselves on the back foot, having to catch up, having to react to things that were said about us and the programme. And people did become frustrated because, I have to take one point, that we were often accused of there being a target of the number of trees that must be felled. And we were always clear that there is no target for must be felled. There's a modelling number for the pricing of the contract, but that doesn't mean that's the number. In fact, I can guarantee you that will not be the number, because things change when you get out there. And it's a bit frustrating that later in the day, a few years later, a Stag spokesperson acknowledges that number was not a target, and it would have been so much easier for it to be the case that was acknowledged at the time, because we spent a long time saying no, and it's hard in communication terms to say what we're being accused of isn't true. Sorry, I'm probably digressing with context here. I think they did an honest and well-meaning job in a very fast-paced and pressurised situation where they never quite knew what was going to come at us today. And they probably felt, well, I know they felt sometimes that, sometimes we would do something on the ground that just made communications, or certainly reputation, even harder to manage, defend and restore. And it became a huge talking point amongst people who genuinely probably didn't have a view one way or the other, but they saw their city in a profile that they didn't particularly like.
Okay. So the next thing I just wanted to clarify is essentially the issues in relation to the dispute or the handling of the dispute or the programme, the kind of issues you discuss with the leader and cabinet members, as opposed to the kinds of things that officers took action on with under delegated authority. The thing I'm driving at is whether there were proper processes followed throughout, as far as you know, in the right people being consulted on the right issues.
Within the council?
Within the council.
Well, when people ask me a question like that, I sit here thinking there's something behind that's caused that question to be asked, and I'm racking my brain to recall anything that would lead me to say actually proper processes were not followed, or the right people were not consulted. And I can't recall that being the case. I mean, the people involved in conversations were the operational people from our client side. Occasionally Amy would come into those discussions. Our legal advisors within the council, our communications people, our policy and strategy people got quite heavily involved as well, and our finance people were involved, because they need to model or make sure that we understood the consequences of some of the things that were being asked of us. And I go back to my earlier answer that we were very keen and cautious not to supplant the normal instructive relationship between the client and contractor. Obviously, we did supplement that with a lot of background discussions. I mean, myself and the leader and the cabinet members, etc., would discuss it. Where are we? Are we sure that we've thought about all this, etc., etc.? What are the options? And every time we concluded that the options are the options. And this should be allowed to proceed. And I say allowed in the sense we didn't pause it, other than when it was paused. But it was continuously and contextually considering it. But the fundamental question was, we have a streets ahead contract here, and are we proceeding or are we not? Because once we're proceeding, and we decided to go ahead in 2012, then it is taken forward by the executive sensibly and rationally. But it would be false to suggest that somehow a 2012 decision was made and we were just left to do it. It was all, but as would be the case in anything, if we had a major a major failure of service within the council, we wouldn't just say, well, the cabinet member will sort it out with the director of X. It would be, can we meet the leader's office just to really understand what's going on here, and have we got the right people in place, and have we got the right thinking in place, etc. So there was a lot of, if I can describe it as a pyramid, where the point of the pyramid are the normal relations, we certainly supplemented what was beneath that in the pyramid. No, I understand, and it follows that you're not aware of any cases where some significantly or potentially quite controversial thing was about to happen, which wasn't cited or didn't have the appropriate political sign-off. Well, you say political sign-off. I mean, not everything is a political sign-off.
No.
I mean, the fact that today it is Road X's turn in the programme, and we plan to proceed doesn't need political sign-off.
No.
It needs
Let me give you an
political
example. My understanding is that you were satisfied that Councillor Lodge had provided a level of political sign-off on not the detailed operational fine-tuning, but on the approach to Rustlings Road. And
I'm satisfied that Councillor Lodge was adequately aware of the plan to proceed with Rustlings Road. I'd be very surprised if he was fully aware of how the escalation, I'm not sure the escalation was planned. I think it happened on site. You know, they're moving the cars and people have been woken up, etc., etc., etc. In that sense. So, I mean, Councillor Lodge is best placed to answer that, but I was satisfied that Councillor Lodge was, you know, as cited as he ought to be as a cabinet member,
right.
and he never came to me afterwards.
Right.
As councillors, you know, are prone to do,
Indeed.
to say, what on earth is going on, John? Why didn't I know anything about this?
Indeed. That's the point I was driving at, really. Okay. Now, the next question kind of follows from that, is, and it's really whether, in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, you feel that the most senior executives on your team who you're relying on, or executive director and above, if you like, might, on occasion, have engaged a little bit more with the operational level on some particular sensitive or controversial operational decisions.
Yeah, so I think if you take Rustlings Road as an example, because it probably is the best example and probably the most extreme example, so we can deduce from that others. With the benefit of hindsight, that was treated as an operational matter. But having had the experience of 2015, so knowing that it was, you know, it was going to have some controversy attached to it, with hindsight, there probably should have been more. Can we just pull this one in for a second? I'm not saying we're stopping it, but can we just scenario, let's run through this in some detail, rather than leave it as an operational decision. The counterpoint to that is we were, not just on Rustlings Road, but as keen as possible to maintain operational structures for three reasons. One was, you know, the profile of the tree dispute may appear to be all-consuming, but this is a very, very, very big council with much bigger problems on its plate at the time in terms of operational issues, finance issues, and actually life issues than this. And we were determined it didn't become a 24/7 issue for everybody, which it could easily have done. Secondly, you know, I'm always clear about what's the added value, and there's very little operational added value of non-experts inserting themselves and saying, just leave it to me, I know what I'm doing. But sometimes they can, though, bring their sort of, just say, run that past me again, please, I don't quite get it, and maybe, you know, on Rustlings Road, that could have been done more emphatically. And the third is that once we were keen that, although it was portrayed as this was not the tree protesters versus the entire council, you know, this big, powerful body sitting in this town hall with everything it's got focused on winning. We never, ever, ever saw this about winning or losing, and that was never the language that I used and the council leader used, and we would ever advocate. Under stress and pressure, I know that some of my officers lapsed into that, and I would pull them up on it, because it's just a cultural and values point. But I don't blame them, because they were shipping a lot of grief on this. But if you go back to my David and Goliath point, it could have been so easy to turn this genuinely into a David and Goliath issue, and we did not want that to be the case. We tried to keep it proportionate, albeit I think the whole thing got a bit out of proportion.
Yeah, okay. there was some. This is sort of the flip side of what you just said. Really, there were some things that, as you know, I'm aware that were considered by the council, but not done. Things like the idea of pursuing a judicial review of the police. Things like ring barking, the use of helicopters. And I just wonder if you could just explain to us the role that, I mean, you were the chief executive, so you played a bit of a role, I'm guessing, in heading off some things that would not have been appropriate.
Yes, and I think I would not be too semantic about this. I think there's a difference between possibilities and options.
Indeed.
So I think somebody in the legal team floated that. I think there was some disquiet in the council that South Yorkshire Police were sort of giving this less attention than they had previously. And some in the legal team, I think, floated, well, you have the right to JR the police. My response was, get over it, we're not doing that.
Right.
Let's do it. I don't think it even graced the lower hills of option on that one. I don't quite remember the helicopter one, but I think I might have been similar to that one. Ring barking, I don't know whether, I think that might have been raised by somebody in Amy, and it was one of those sort of, well, you know, we've heard that in some places they ring bark trees, and my line, and I can remember very clearly, is, well, we ain't doing that.
Right.
Full stop. So, you know, I think I wouldn't even grace them with the word option.
Right.
I don't think they were ever even, you know, it wasn't even, oh, really? What's that all about? It's like, forget it. We ain't doing it. And you just put them out of court.
But the fact that someone was piping up with those ideas tells us something. You'd accept?
No, I don't accept it. Well, of course it tells you something. It always tells you something. It tells you that people think, just looking around, saying, well, you know, you could. You could. There's thousands of coulds. There's very few shoulds.
Yes.
And I don't think I think everyone was casting around thinking, what else could we do? But I don't think, I would counsel that one shouldn't read anything into the fact that people look around and say, oh, yeah, I'm not even sure if it was in this country where someone had ring barked trees. I'd never heard of it, actually, ever, until they explained it to me. I said, well, you know, no, thank you, goodbye.
Yeah.
We ain't doing that. So I don't, you know, I don't want it to come across as chief executive thwarted crazy idea.
No.
It never got to that status.
Anyway, you recognise it tells us something. There's a debate about what it tells us. That's fine.
It tells you people were horizon scanning for anything, and
right.
were, I think, literally reporting what they'd spotted on the horizon without judgment or proposition.
Do you have a view on how effectively or otherwise the system of checks and balances over the council's decision-making worked during the dispute? One or two other people have sort of talked a bit about that. I just wonder if you have a view.
In a sort of proper decision-making
and overall, yeah.
Again, it's one of those questions that, you know, the fact the question is answered causes me to pause, because before the question, my honest answer, which will be my answer actually, is that I think proper decision-making was maintained throughout. You know, this was a highly regulated relationship. It may, you know, at the people-to-people level, it may have been a highly partnership type, but it was highly regulated with a structure attached to it. My recollection was that it was maintained at all times, and I'm pretty confident if it wasn't, somebody would have spotted it and challenged us, because we got challenged on most things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What changed that made it possible to find a resolution to the dispute in the spring of 2018 when it hadn't been possible before? Yeah, so I think two things really. One, the mood in this. Most people. I mean, I live in this city. Always have done. So, you know, and one of the reasons I did it as chief executive was you learn a lot about how you're doing by being here on a Sunday morning and a Friday night. People talk to you. Sometimes you don't want them to talk to you, but they talk to you. And most people were perplexed about this dispute and hadn't taken a side at all. They just said, well, what's it all about? And often
they'd got some view that when I genuinely explained that we were not doing a scorched earth policy of felling trees, we were replacing them, etc. They was like, oh, right, well, that sounds pretty good. But towards 2018, and councillors would have picked up, because they all live in the city as well, they absorb this. A phrase that somebody used to me, which really is, I haven't got a view on this at all, John, but will somebody stop the hurt? And it was a really powerful phrase that they used. And what it was is that they love their city, they're proud of their city, and they didn't like to see it, in the Guardian or whatever it might be, with confrontation being the imagery of what is fundamentally a peaceable city. Now, it was confrontation involving a very small number of people, but it was still confrontation as a bit of a representation of Sheffield. So that mood was there. Was someone? I suppose there's 3 points. There was 2. There's 3. One is that the whole programme had just ground to a halt, and there was no point just slugging forward trying to create safe working spaces, because we were getting nowhere. And because we weren't in the win-lose sort of mindset, it didn't feel like a defeat. It felt like this can't go on like this. Now, someone would say, well, you could have decided that in 2015. Hindsight, etc., is marvellous. But thirdly, therefore, I think in that context, it was recognised that some form of conciliation was needed. Because we had a choice, basically. Well, we had 3 choices, I guess. One was to use ever more dramatic means of progressing, which wasn't going to, may not have worked and wasn't going to stop the hurt. Or we could continue to stand toe-to-toe every Monday morning on Street X or Street Y, and Amy would pack up their tools and go home, and so on. Or we could say, well, let's try the conciliation route, and that was basically what came to pass. I've looked back and thought, was there a sort of eureka moment when that? And I don't think it was. I think there was a change of mood about conciliation rather than just proceeding, because proceeding was proving to be futile.
So do you recall, say in January, February 2018, councillors starting to say to you or others, look, I'm not sure we've got the right approach here, or do you recall the interventions from, say, the local MPs, or the public statement that Alan Billings was making, and the concerns the police had about overstretched resources?
Well, I think we were cognizant of the fact that call them stakeholders, if you like, MPs, Police and Crime Commissioner, etc., were of the view that something needed to change. I think quite a lot of them were quite clear and quite careful not to say this is the wrong programme in terms of tree replacement. Some will have done on the record, but it was something needs to change here, because they were getting a lot of pressure through their constituency mailboxes and surgeries, etc. So there was that context there, and I've always maintained that the job of a public body is never to stop listening. When you've been shouted at a lot, metaphorically and literally, sometimes a natural defence is to cover one's ears, but the danger with that is you do that, sometimes you don't hear the voice in that shouting that you really ought to hear. So we were listening. We weren't sort of trading our opinions a bit against us now. I think it goes back to that, will someone stop the hurt? There was a general mood. And councillors are plugged into the city, as I say, they're of this city. They probably started to develop that mood as well. I can't, casting my mind back now 4 years, recall much in January, February. The change point for me was when, and I don't think this was a personality change, it was more sort of a fresh start change, is when Councillor Lewis Dagnall, who became the cabinet member, came to see me and say, I'd like us to consider how we could develop some conciliation programme.
So that was in May.
That would have been May, yeah. But
in fact, the tree replacement programme finished at the end of March.
it paused. Yeah. No,
There
absolutely.
were no more operations after the end of March.
Yeah, indeed. But that's my point, is that we'd ground to a halt.
Right.
So yeah, there were lots of moments of stepping back. You know,
Yes.
It wasn't that early 2018 was the first step. Rustings Road was a step back in 2015. This is, the council wasn't like, we move forward, we don't break step. We were always, trying to find ways of proceeding in a way that was done safely, properly, and with people with us. And I still, to this day, no one really knows what the general mood of this city was towards the tree program. I know people who came to me who said, I can't say this publicly, but crack on. And I don't mean people in positions of authority. I mean, I say genuine citizens. We're all genuine citizens, but people with no position whatsoever to say that. No, yes, I'm aware of that. But in terms of let's engage with the bishop, etc.
Yes, no, that came later. Yeah. Some people think that the Forestry Commission entering the debate had an effect. Could you comment on whether that's true or not?
I don't think that's true.
Say again?
I don't think that's...
You don't think that's true?
I mean, I recall the Forestry Commission's intervention, a bit of a surprise. To go back to your point about good decision making, that when what you're doing gets scrutinised, that if there are faults, they're in a decision making that led up to that action, not the action itself. Yeah. Particularly for a public body. So we were confident. We were surprised, but we were confident. And of course, the Forestry Commission, they wrote a letter with various comments in it. But the short version of that letter was no action.
The report they produced about 2 years later. Is that what you're referring to?
I think a letter came in, didn't it?
There was a letter announcing an investigation. A letter came in. There were two letters, one in March, one in April 2018, essentially announcing an investigation for potential unlawful felling.
And the conclusion was it was not unlawful.
Well, there was subsequently, they did a long investigation, published a report, in which everybody can see what they said in the report.
Yeah, but I think it did conclude it was not unlawful.
Well, I don't want to pass the report because it's quite a complicated
it is a long report
actually.
I mean, others may have been more impacted by it. I mean, you take account of all these things. You always look at it and you think it's a bit like a JR, really, in that sense. You look at it, you're thinking, let's just look at this one again. But I mean, this council probably gets. All councils get JR more often than they take out injunctions. Yes. And this council in particular has got a massively successful record of defending JRs. Yes. But as I say, the defence is nearly always based upon how a decision was reached. Yes, indeed. JRs are very hard, they're probably impossible to fix once it's been launched, because it's about how you got to the point of launch. Yeah. So, yes. I think.
Okay. So that's helpful. A range of factors, basically. But the mood of the city was an important
and it permeated everything.
Yes, it permeated everything. Yeah. Okay. So, with the benefit of hindsight, what do you think the consequences of the dispute were, and what do you think the council might have done differently?
Is this the lessons learned question, or is there another one about broader lessons learned?
Well, no, it's
see how expansive do I go?
Well, cover the full range of what you'd like to say, please.
Okay, yeah. So I have thought about this a lot, not just because of your inquiry, but it was a major issue, and the lessons that can be learned, I think, from any situation. The more specific they are to that situation, the less helpful they are as lessons.
Right. Because
they will not be applicable to
other situations.
And it's hard to be definitive that this was a unique contract, but it was a very rare contract, the likes of which may not be seen for some considerable time, just because of its scale and comprehensive nature, not because of some people regarded it as having negative elements within it. And I think the two or three things I'd say. One is it's very hard to predict in advance what's going to, if I put in quotes, go wrong. So predicting what's going to go wrong is probably not the solution to being ready for it. I think there's a point about variation, and there's a point about escalation.
Right.
And then there's a point about conciliation.
Right.
And I think that wherever possible, and it's very hard in the PFI contract, to design in how you are going to introduce variations if ever they are needed. Now, that's relatively easy in a simple client contract relationship, because you just sit down and say, the way for design, if you design it in, of course, you avoid the situation where the contractor will sit down saying, well, you never told me about this when you let the contract, so that's another £5 million, please. You know, you've got that boxed off, so create that. I think the escalation point is that have very sharp I've always maintained that actually most people, and people in authority, are pretty ordinary people. I mean, sometimes we sit here thinking, I'm not quite sure that's going to go well, but you sit on it because you think you're the only person in the room who's down to it. Everyone's got the same thought. So really, really sharpen antennae.
Yes.
And scenario test anything in a sensitive situation that you think might go, might inflame. The conciliation point is actually probably create the expectation of conciliation as a tool in the toolkit right from the start, so that you don't have to go through confrontation as much as we did before you get to conciliation. And the final point I'd make is that, and highways are difficult issues because they are a very significant statutory responsibility. They affect many things, not just how smooth is the road, but are those tree roots affecting my cellar? Am I going to trip on the pavement or not, etc., etc. But in a situation where a community, let's say a road, is absolutely clear that they do not want something to happen, and the authority is clear that actually it cannot itself carry the risk of not carrying out that repair or that action, is there a means of the community taking on that responsibility? Now, I actually think in highways that's probably impossible, given the laws of the land. But my point about generic lessons is that sometimes your confrontation is because actually you've got two different starting points. The community is saying, don't do it, and the authority is saying, but I must do it. And they never get into a conversation about, well, why do you have to do it? It's like, I'll stop you, I will proceed. And then you've got, toe to toe. So actually exploring early on, is there a way of actually just understanding why the authority, whatever the authority is, wants to take its course of action, and is there a way of remediating or accepting some of the pressure that they feel they're under? So a playground might be a softer example about that. We're going to remove the play equipment because it's unsafe and we can't carry liability. Well, maybe it shouldn't be your playground, maybe somebody else should. And it would actually be a test of community. Sometimes it's quite easy to step up to the protest plate, but are you prepared to step up to the responsibility plate as well? That's where I would come from.
Okay, so those are generic lessons. That's very helpful. Anything else you want to say about what you think the consequences of what happened were?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. Without being flippant, I think some of the consequences you probably won't see for 10, 15 years, because there are few trees now that are dying disease, whatever, in this city that are still in place, and they will continue to be diseased and continue to die, and they may leave a hole. So, in some respects, what will the street tree stock in Sheffield look like in 15 to 20 years' time? No one quite knows. The roads that have been remediated will be in healthy fettle, as they say, round here. There are a small number of roads in Sheffield that are still very poor because they've been unable to be maintained, and a small number of pavements that for someone in a wheelchair or with a pushchair are impassable, and that's a shame. But others might say it is a shame, but it's a small price to pay for that mature tree remaining in my neighbourhood. I think, this inquiry in some sense of irony will re-raise the profile of the tree dispute, but I think by and large the city has moved far on from it, because the profile and the conflict, the visible conflict the visible conflict has ceased and the profile has dropped. So I think in terms of the city's mood, there is no lasting consequence. I suspect this council, and I've not been a chief executive here for nearly 3 years, so I hesitate to speak for it, but I would speculate that everyone's sensitivity is sharpened because of this, and it would be important for that to be institutionalised rather than just be in the institutional memory of those who were here at the time. But I've worked elsewhere where modern consultation guidelines were written on the back of a failed consultation on the residence parking scheme. So some of these changes can be institutionalised. Quite what those changes might be for others to follow is a matter of discussion. But maybe even just seeing this as a case study of where a well-intentioned, well-resourced programme met, who knows what the numerical opposition was, but determined vocal and physical opposition. What happened and how would it be done differently would be a good scenario for other places to look at.
Okay, thank you. Is there, you sort of touched on the last question I wanted to ask you, really, but is there anything else you want to say about what else might be done to minimise the risk of problems re-emerging in future, given the contract's still got another 15 years to run?
It depends how heavily the pill is sugared, is my point. Nobody, on the public sector side, nobody particularly likes 25-year contracts with the rigidity of a PFI. And I think in operational assets like hospitals, etc., they've proven to be very problematic because there's a lot of wear and tear and replacement that is needed there that is not always anticipated and therefore becomes very expensive. I think that we all favour, and the phrase I've used before with private sector providers is long-term relationships with short-term commitments, so that 25 years is an incredibly long time to foresee the future. 5 years is a pretty long time. So I think one of the lessons, if given a choice, we didn't have a choice, and I don't bemoan that. Mm-hmm. PFI was the policy, and the money came with it, and that was great. And by and large, the roads of Sheffield are massively improved.
Yes.
I don't bemoan it, but in a world of free choice, seek to avoid the long-term lock-in, which means that you can't wait out a contract anomaly until you get a chance to revisit the contract.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Is there anything you've not had a chance to say that you want to tell us?
One thing which I've said in the hearing, and I'll just say it again because trying to move forward is actually, I would hope, I can't speak for those who protested, but I do genuinely believe that this council and the population of the city and the subset of that population that were the tree protesters in whatever guise all wanted the same thing, and we all do want the same thing. And sometimes it came across as us wanting to denude the city of trees and others wanted to preserve them. And it was never that, and it will never be that. To contextualise it, the dispute with those who disputed it were about the means and method of achieving that goal. That's what divided us. The ambition, in my view, did not divide us, and it's worth holding on to that, because I think that's what binds people going forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think that concludes the hearing. Charles, you can stop the recording.